At this time, I would like to call up Councilwoman Jenny Webster for closing remarks.
Good morning, and in closing, I wanted to share some thoughts with you today. No other ethnic group in the United States is more culturally diverse than Native Americans. Our culture has survived for the past 500 years. Be proud of that. Nobody can take that from us. Our leadership of 100 years ago was tasked with safeguarding our land, our language, and our traditions. Our leadership of today is also tasked with safeguarding our land, our language, and our traditions. Our leadership cannot do this alone. Without the support of our community, we need you too to help safeguard our land, our language, and our traditions. As Native people, we are survivors. We'll survive this pandemic if we work together and look to protect each other, watch over one another, lay eyes on one another. As Native people, we are resilient. We've endured displacement, assimilation, annihilation. We need to lift up our brothers and sisters when they need a helping hand and not look down on them. Just like a single arrow is easily broken, a bundle of arrows is strong and will survive. As Native people, we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day today with you. Our Indigenous spirit connects us to each and every one of you, and we pray for peace within you. We thank you for joining us this morning. Go out today with a good mind, a good heart, and a strong fire.
We're going to get one more mic set up. And as that's happening, I'd like to, invite and greet the Governor Evers, to Sovereign Land. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And next we will have our Culture Advisor, Bob Brown, give a prayer.
Ana ne tunu ne kan chokod ne hakwego ne chi nachte sokwawi sokwaya disu ne chi huncha de ne hakwego ne wahada sawakwe ne chi nu ne ni kwasita ka slakwa tunu hakwego lut ka ladu chi nachte laudia de gen haslan ka hake ka kwachi la yandunse ne tunu akwe kung wawada sawakwe kani hanasa kani tudiyansa lona to jakunse tonio le ne lodix tohuha ne hakwe kung ne hoskanhe chotkot ne nadwali hwana wago chi nahte kaya ne chuhunchade yade jungwe ne hakwe kung watwali hwanix sukwaya dizu chot kot kui sugwading gula lake ohunchage ne ndio kwatawali daga nahte ne nayawane daga hajelusla sochi ayawane chinu ne yukwana glaslaya onya daaga ne nyukwa hunchod da ne kui ka ikawa nislade dohka ne nikawanake ne nakwawane nikase ka ika ne haste chiwige da ne tunya tak ne nakwatniko. At this time, we give greetings to one another, and we give thanks for all of the things that has been provided for our well-being here on this earth, that we call our mother. All of the things that were mentioned before, the various people that came up here and gave recognition to all of the things that we say that we are entrusted with our lives here on this earth, that we try to do the very best that we can as human beings on this earth. We give acknowledgement for all of the things that has been placed here for our well-being on this earth that we call our mother. And we say that all of the things start with our children, from the smallest child to the young people, our youth, adults to our elders, that we are still continuing to hold together as best as we can the responsibilities that we have been given. And so all of the people as well that have gathered here today, all of our visitors here in our community, that we give greetings and well-being to each and every one of you as your families as well. And so today we give thanksgiving to the Creator, and that each and every one of us have that good health, that strong mind, and that strong fire between one another as we travel forward. Yanko.
Thank you, Bob. And at this time, I would like to invite up Honorable Governor Evers for his remarks.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. And thank you for welcoming me as we celebrate and recognize Indigenous Peoples Day right here in the state of Wisconsin. It was a pleasure and an honor in 2019 to designate the second Monday of October henceforth as Indigenous Peoples Day in our state, to recognize the critical importance Native nations play in the state, to reaffirm our commitment to upholding tribal sovereignty, and to celebrate indigenous cultures. I want to thank the Oneida Nation and Chairman Hill for having me today, as well as President Holsey of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians for joining us also. Today, as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, we're celebrating generations of really resilient tribal communities, communities who have such rich cultures, languages, and traditions that prevail today despite all odds. Over the past year, we've seen an international awakening to abhorrent injustices that took place in our country in not so distant past. Native kids were taken from their families to attend boarding schools where they were forced to assimilate to white culture and stripped of their cultural identity and traditions. Many experienced horrible living conditions impacting their physical and mental health and their well-being. Obviously, this deeply impacted their families and communities for generations. But these are stories that Native communities have known for years. I've heard them myself. These stories have been erased from mainstream history books and reporting, and unfortunately, the sheer lack of documentation means that we don't know the full scope and effects of boarding schools in Wisconsin and across the country. Because of this lack of documentation, the U.S. Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, announced a federal investigation into boarding schools in America to identify boarding school facilities and sites, possible burial sites for students at or near those facilities, and the tribal affiliations of those kids interred there. From what we know, there were at least 10 boarding and day schools here in Wisconsin, and it's estimated hundreds of Native children from Wisconsin were forced to attend out-of-state schools in addition. It's estimated that thousands of Native American kids in Wisconsin were forced to attend one of these schools, leaving generations of trauma inflicted on Native families and communities, and a loss of language, culture, and identity. The trauma boarding school policies had on Native American communities, along with acts of assimilation and racism, contribute to present disproportionate outcomes in health, education, economic well-being often experienced by Native people. You know, we cannot erase the past, but we also can't let the past be erased. So today I will be signing Executive Order 136, which takes several important actions. First, this executive order formally recognizes and apologizes for the tragedies inflicted upon Native American communities at the hand of state and federal governments and other institutions that operated these boarding schools and enacted these policies. As a state, we bear the responsibility for acknowledging the trauma and pain inflicted on tribal communities then and today. And we have a moral responsibility to not only investigate the truth, but pursue a more just and equitable relationship with Native nations. Additionally, the executive order commits that as a state we'll support the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative and Secretary Holland's investigation, and that we will welcome the Department of Interior to investigate boarding schools that once operated in our state, as well as that all investigatory efforts by the federal government be undertaken with consultation with Wisconsin's Native nations. And we'll be submitting all this information to the U.S. Department of Interior as they continue to do their important work. As governor and on behalf of the state, I am ready to be a partner in this work and to continue to respect the inherent sovereignty of Wisconsin's Native nations while striving each day to be a better partner as we work to build a more equitable and just tomorrow. So today, we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. The indigenous community members who have defended the land, protected the water, championed Native rights, sovereignty, and prosperity. The amazing resilience and lasting legacy of indigenous culture, language, and traditions have been sustained by generations of indigenous people who refuse to be erased. So thank you so much for being here today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome to the microphone President Shannon Holsley.
Kolamasi, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to thank Chairman Hill and esteemed colleagues, leadership, the governor, the mayor, and everybody else. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I was really taken back by some of the words that were shared previous to this and the succinctness and the simplicity of what was said. With regards to that, Treasurer Danforth said Indigenous Peoples Day is every day, and that's exactly correct. That she said that, you know, the injustices and the systematic racism that's faced upon Indigenous communities has been since first contact and the disparities. But she also reminded us the resilience that's in all of us in terms of what we need to do, in terms of how we become the voice of the voiceless, and we continue to advocate and steward those injustices. And really today, Indigenous Peoples Day is a day to remember the sovereignty, history, and contributions and resilience of all Indigenous people across the United States. It's also a day for us to all identify systematic and ongoing issues in Indian country and a call for progress and change. Especially fitting on Indigenous Peoples Day, we recognize and pay homage to our elders and those that we have lost or that we're forced to endure. We mourn for our communities, our cultures, and our languages, and the innocence that was stolen. Indigenous communities will continue to work to ensure that none of our American Indians and Alaska Native children are ever forgotten, and to ensure that the wrongs imposed upon both past and present generations will never be repeated. Our nation's history and the treatment of Native American people is not an easy one to tell. It's not easy to hear or to acknowledge, but our discomfort in sharing our painful collective history probably pales in comparison to the lived experience and the realities that so many Native people endured and were forced assimilation of the federal government and the Indian boarding schools, and the systematic failure that Indigenous people continue to face today. Indian boarding schools were a byproduct of colonization, ultimately engineered by the United States government. More than 300 boarding schools were funded by the government and were often run by various Christian denominations. These schools were places where aspects of Indigenous culture were unwelcome and prohibited. The government's vision for the boarding schools was explained by one of their architects, General Richard Henry Pratt of Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, as a method of assimilation. Kill the Indian, save the man. While these practices and our participation in such schools ended decades ago, their traumatic effects have continued to reverberate through the generations and are still present with many today. Fundamental to those schools were the structures and the practices which forced Indigenous children to be separated from their families and prohibited these children from speaking their language and their practicing their culture, and that treatment is too painful to even verbalize. The impact of these actions authorized by our government upon a Native American people and cultures is something that we can never truly make whole. In many respects, Native cultures were gutted by the impact and loss of Native children, and that is something that we as American people and First Nations people need to acknowledge and learn from, and reckon with in order to support Indian self-determination and healing. Indigenous Peoples Day recenters Indigenous perspectives and ultimately allows people to gain a better understanding of Indigenous resistance and resilience in the face of colonization. Indigenous Peoples Day highlights the Native communities that have been always here. Indigenous people has become a way to respect and honor and educate the world about our significant contributions since time immemorial. It acknowledges a true and accurate account of history of Indigenous peoples, and it sets the historical record straight and respects our culture, our languages, and our traditions and lifeways, and especially our Indigenous ancestors who have endured so much, and allows for the truth and reconciliation of the perpetual historical trauma experienced by Indigenous communities as we embark upon a truth and healing process. Anisha.
Thank you, President Holsey, and welcome. Next, I would like to invite back up Chairman Dehazendaze Hill.
Again, I'd just like to again thank everyone for your participation today in the acknowledgement of Indigenous Peoples Day. I'd like to welcome and thank the Governor, welcome and thank President Holsey, welcome and thank Mayor Eric Genrich and my council as well. It's not an ideal position to be in nowadays with the pandemic and different traumatic events over this past year and a half, but you know, I'm very glad that I have the leadership here with me to help support our nation, Oneida Nation, through these troubling times, and I definitely wouldn't be able to do that without the support from my team, my council, and from other tribal leaders throughout the state, and my local governments as well, and the state government, really trying to make sure that we move forward through this pandemic and being able to hold events like this and acknowledge the historical traumas and atrocities that have happened to Indigenous people across this country, as so noted by the many speakers we had this morning. And so again, I'd just like to thank you all for your participation and being here, and acknowledgement of Indigenous Peoples Day as we continue to raise our history to all the different perspectives that we've seen and lived, and that our ancestors have lived. So I think that's very important for that acknowledgement. And again, so Yamako to our singers and to our